Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar of our series, Grappling with Gauguin. All of these webinars will be featured on our website, wpi.art, as they are being recorded now. Today, we will be featuring a talk entitled Beyond Gauguin, Tracing the Colonial Stereotype of the Exotic Pacific Island Woman, featuring three well-versed experts on this topic. First, we have joining us from Copenhagen, Anna Kærsgaard Gregersen, who is a curator of French art of the 19th and 20th century at the new Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen. Her curatorial practice focuses on transhistorical and transnational dialogues across contemporary, modern, and ancient art, exploring and challenging the conventions of contemporary exhibition practices. Her recent exhibitions include Abbas Akavan, Curtain Call, Suzanne Valadon, Model, Painter, and Rebel, Michael Armitage, Account of an Illiterate Man, and Paul Gauguin, Why Are You Angry, in 2020. It was this last exhibition, which I happened to see in Berlin in 2021, that was the driving force behind the idea of this lecture series. Next, we have Patricia O'Brien coming to us from Washington, D.C. Patricia is a historian and analyst of Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. She has held the J.I. Kislock Fellow in American Studies at the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress and the J.D. Stout Fellow in New Zealand Studies at Victoria University, Wellington. She is also an Australian Research Council Future Fellow at the Australia National University, where she remains attached to the Department of Pacific Affairs. In 2020, she returned to Georgetown University, where she had worked from 2000 to 2013, to the university's Asia Studies and History departments. And finally, we have with us from Auckland, New Zealand, Angela Tiatia. Angela is a New Zealand Australian artist whose work explores contemporary culture through performance, moving image, painting, sculpture, and photography, drawing out the relationships between representation, gender, neocolonialism, and the commodification of body and place. Often through the lens of history, popular and material culture, Tiatia moves deftly in her compositions of still and moving image, from pointed detail to satellite view, addressing themes within power structures and how these impact the individual and their communities. I am so pleased to have these three speakers here today, and I welcome them to this conversation. I'll turn the stage over to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me just share. Okay, thank you so much for the introduction and invitation, Elisabeth, and the Wildenstein-Plattner Institute for this very kind invitation. The three of us are very excited to be connected and have the opportunity to talk here today, so thank you for that. Before diving into both Patty's and Angela's exciting research and practice, I have the opportunity to give you a brief introduction to the exhibition that in a way kind of brought us all together in the first place. So my name is Anna Gregersen, and I am a curator at New Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen, as Elisabeth said. This museum, which some of you might know already, holds one of the world's finest collections of Paul Gauguin, consisting of nearly 60 works, spanning both paintings, ceramics, and wood carvings. But with this collection comes also great responsibility. For decades, Gauguin have been exhibited in prominent museums worldwide. Prior to the exhibition Paul Gauguin, Why Are You Angry?, the Glyptotek alone had held 6 Gauguin exhibitions. Given that there has been absolutely no lack of interest, one might ask why the artist should once again fill the gallery spaces. A question I too have asked myself several times. But despite my initial skepticism, I realized that even with the massive attention Gauguin had been given, there is still much more to be done, said, and negotiated. And so in 2020, the museum opened its 7th Gauguin exhibition, this time mapping not only the myth of the artist, but also the colonial myth of Tahiti and the South Pacific, traced both within and beyond Gauguin's works. Gauguin made a name of himself in the previous French colony of Tahiti, but it is also here that Gauguin's works start to show ambiguity and divide opinion. On one side of the debate, Gauguin is labeled a pedophile, a colonist, a racist, and a narcissist. A 19th century Harvey Weinstein, as the Telegraph called him. On the other side of the debate, Gauguin is praised for his artistic qualities, claimed to rise above the historical and political context of their creator. This split between artwork and artist, artistic ambitions and political context, is true in a contemporary context, but it was also the case during the lifetime of the artist, when one side of the critical establishment saw his Polynesian work as cliched colonial art, while the other saw him as creating a new style of modern painting. But as this exhibition wanted to show, both extremes risk failing to see the rich potential that exists precisely in the synergy between artwork and artist. So without taking Gauguin hostage based on contemporary ethics, but also without providing him with an alibi for his controversial way of life, this exhibition insisted on occupying the gray zone between artwork and artist. This ambiguous reading was not necessarily an easy or comfortable space to occupy, but its very complexity also broadened the range of curatorial possibilities. Gauguin's gray zone helped shape one of the exhibition's key arguments. If the discussion between the artist and artwork is not simply the result of contemporary theoretical positioning, the discussion might also be inherent to Gauguin's very own works, reinforcing what a rich source they can be if used carefully. From here, an important curatorial entry point followed. What happens if one takes the gray zone, seemingly already embodied in Gauguin's works, and use it as a curatorial method? A method that wanted to stay loyal to the arguments already offered by Gauguin's own artworks, while at the same time acknowledging the need to produce both historical and contemporary counter-narratives. In past Gauguin exhibitions, these counter-narratives have mostly been used as paratext in seminars, catalog essays, or special film screenings. Our exhibition wanted to do the opposite, to take all that conflicted material into the exhibition as the curatorial starting point, and from here use the blockbuster name of Gauguin and the seductive qualities of his work to draw our audience's eyes to what they usually avoid. This was especially important because even if we made it clear that Gauguin's works were part of a Western fabricated fantasy, our audiences wouldn't get past the false imagery of Tahiti if not confronted directly with counter-narratives, other artists, artworks, materials, perspectives, and voices. It seemed no longer enough to practice a deconstruction of Gauguin. One had to treat the exhibition as a construction site with fluid structures that needed to be built and continuously remodeled. So here I'm just going to show you a few installation shots of the exhibition. So the exhibition brought historical and contemporary art as well as archival material together, covering the 18th, late 19th, and 21st century. The exhibition showed how Gauguin's decision to move to Tahiti was influenced by a racialized and romanticized myth of the island that had flourished in Europe for over a century as part of the colonization of Tahiti. The exhibition traced this colonial myth that Gauguin was fascinated by, adopted in his art, and in some ways continues to keep alive through his works as a leading marketing figure of Western tourism for French Polynesia. It is therefore no surprise that when a cruise ship named after the artist deprives its so-called cultural ambassadors their personal names and pronouns and instead refer to them as Gauguins, many Polynesians want a different story to be told. The exhibition therefore also turned to the 21st century. Here, a selection of mainly cross-Polynesian contemporary artists offered the kind of queer, feministic, and decolonial counter-narratives that I, as a white curator, or the Glyptotek as a Western institution, were unable to do so. The contemporary artists Yuki Kihara, Selina Tushitila-Marsh, Lashashi Scare, and Angela Tiatia, as well as the late Tahitian activist and artist Henri Giraud, aimed in different ways to return agency to Polynesians themselves by returning the right to represent to those represented. But let me be clear, the exhibition was not necessarily about or for a specific audience. On the contrary, acknowledging our limitations as organizers, the exhibition focused on what role we, the museum, Gauguin, myself alike, had played in the myth-making of Tahiti as Western consumers and tourists. And so, for this exhibition, the artist's work did not only teach us about the period in which they were created, they also encouraged Westerners to interrogate the perspective we ourselves see the world from and which and whose culture we consume. And from this process of self-scrutiny, motivated and challenged by historical and contemporary counter-narratives, I'm now very excited to present two brilliant voices I was blessed to work with on the occasion of the exhibition. So artist Angela Tiatia, who contributed to the exhibition with equally stunning and thought-provoking works, as well as Patricia O'Brien, who delivered an absolutely fascinating text for our exhibition catalog. I'm very excited to have you here in this conversation and also to bring the two of you together because your research shares so many similar qualities. So thank you both for being here. I know we are going to move beyond Gauguin. That's like the topic of this talk today. But initially, I want to stay a little bit in the trouble and ask both of you about your personal relationship with Gauguin. Because looking at these images, these are, you know, the building, the ground for the discourse, the problematic discussion surrounding this artist. So I was just very curious to hear about your personal relationship with this artist. Do you want to start, Angela?
Thank you so much for that. So my personal relationship with Gauguin, I think, starts not directly referencing the artist himself and his work, but through a diverted path before I did eventually come to his work. And I started as a model when I was 17 years old. And one of my first big roles was actually working for the Kevin Costner film called Rapa Nui, which is Easter Island. And I spent, I think, about 4 months on the island. And I didn't realize then, but I have to confess that I was very into the idea and the script. At the time, I didn't realize how steeped I was within the myth making, that it was only much later as I became an artist that I realized my role being played within that cultural creation within commercialization within Hollywood, and the exploitation of our narratives. And so through my very first work, Hibiscus rosa sinensis, it was the very start of the beginning of my understanding of the way that Pacific Islanders, particularly Pacific Island women, have been portrayed in the past. And so there is a urban myth within Pacific Island culture when you experience our islands as a tourist, that the red hibiscus can signify your sexual availability. So if it's worn on one part, on the left side of the ear, it represents that you're taken, or on the that you're available, and on the right side that you're taken. And I never really took up that gesture. And so I one day was just compelled to try to have a counter narrative. So I just instinctually put the hibiscus in my mouth and ate the myth. And it's interesting because these symbolisms, when they're related to the Pacific body, they have been embodied within Pacific Island culture itself as its own myth. And so I take on those ideas of taking old myths or the way that representation or culture is representing us, and using that as part of the work. And so with material culture, which you show in the exhibition, I have images of the beginnings of those counter narratives. So there's a photograph of a painting of Gauguin, which features 3 Pacific Islanders, and then there's a photographic image replicating that. And all these objects were purchased online on eBay, and they had to be purchased under specific tags, because I realized that on eBay there is a collector's way of tagging images so that you can find them quickly. And so I would only purchase items and images that had stereotypical terms such as bare-breasted native or hula girl, and then buying those and bringing them back to me so that I could have them physically. And so it's the idea of presenting the ideas of neocolonialism or colonialism and putting them on display in ways where it displays objects and images that are made not by Pacific Islanders, but by Europeans, and that they represent us, and then being sold and traded and displayed, collected by non-Pacific Islanders. And so that's my way into my practice.
Thank you so much, Angela. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into your practice. We're going to see a video work by you, and also look a bit more close to material culture that you just described. But I think it illustrates very nicely how broad the myth of the South Pacific island girl is, or woman is, portrayed. And Gauguin is not the only one doing this. He is part of a bigger culture, and that is also really exciting to have you here, Patty, because a big part of your research is actually tracing this colonial myth of the South Pacific island woman throughout history. So, but before, you're going to give us a presentation about the beginning of this myth. But just out of curiosity, I want to ask you the same question. What is your relationship to Gauguin? Do you remember the first time you saw a work by him, or the first time he kind of like entered your research, maybe in a critical way?
Thank you, Anna. That's a really good question. You're making me really sort of like race back through my mind about when this all started, because I really started working on this when I was a young woman researching for my PhD at the University of Sydney, and my PhD became the book called The Pacific Muse, Exotic Femininity in the Colonial Pacific. And I kind of think of that book as a person, and she's currently about 17 years old, the Pacific Muse. And obviously, when you're looking at colonial stereotypes of the Pacific, Gauguin is ubiquitous. He's everywhere. He was sort of this monolithic, these monolithic images that seem to be everywhere, and also that seemed to be conveying some kind of a truth. There was this sort of acceptance that there was some kind of authenticity to them, and that they sort of stood apart because of who painted them and the kind of cultural heights that they'd taken. But what I started to do was go back and look at the depths of this image and not leave them intact, and not see them as some kind of snapshots of Pacific culture, but rather these confected images that had deep, steeped histories in the Western tradition. And so people had sort of been seeing Gauguin as a continuation of the imagery of produced in the late 18th century, these first very exoticized images of the Pacific. But then as the more I kind of looked at these images, and Anna, you're going to show the image of William Hodges. Yes, this one. Okay, so this is one of these classic sort of epitome images from the late 18th century, which is encapsulating the personification of the myth that sparked all this sort of electrification and interest in the Pacific back in Europe. So rather than stopping there, rather than just sort of seeing Gauguin as a product of this art produced in the age of exploration, which really dates from the 1760s, and a series of exhibitions, both British and French, that went to Tahiti. I started looking back further and seeing that you can't explain these images and suggest that they came out of nowhere, but that they had these deep, steeped histories that went back to the very origins of Western culture. So I started looking at the stories of exotic femininity that date from classical Greece, and how those stories then stories and iconography and images about women's sexuality, this pre-Christian age where women's sexuality was supposedly unbounded by any kind of restrictions or proscribed by notions of sin, that there is a direct connection with that classical past and the way that Europeans began to see the Pacific in the late 18th century. And then Gauguin, 100 years or so after those first images from the late 18th century, started producing his own images. He's using and reciting such a catalogue of ideas, which to do with the young women, to do with water, to do with tropical climate, to do with the display of bodies and what that means, and this sexual availability of women, which Gauguin took to quite a different level, both in his artistic practice and the way that he lived in Polynesia. So that's my kind of relationship with Gauguin, trying to challenge him to unsettle him, to make people not just take what he did for granted, but really to try to see him as part of a colonial continuum that had direct relationship to the overall colonial agenda about extending European power, and also a masculinized European power over the Pacific region.
Thank you so much for that presentation of your entry point. You mentioned already a lot of topics that I think we're going to circulate around during this talk. And I know that you wanted to introduce more from the beginning up till what is happening with what is the myth of the South Pacific from a European point of view in 19th century. What is it about? Why is it that the South Pacific woman and Tahiti becomes this lost idea of a lost golden age or something very ideal? Or why was it such a popular image in Europe?
Well, I think you can trace that back to the first few, the first three expeditions to the Pacific. The first one was the British, sorry, I shouldn't say the Pacific, I should get more specific than that and say Tahiti. So the first one was the British voyage in 1767 that was captained by Samuel Wallis, and that was on the boat the Dolphin. And that was the first European encounter with Tahiti. And what happened with that encounter, and what kind of gets erased from the story about how the sexual exchanges that took place and became quite legendary as the parts of his expedition voyages that became the most scandalous and sensationalized were the sexual connections between his men and the island women. What gets erased from that story is that there was a 5-day naval bombardment of the island prior to those exchanges. There was, a deliberate enactment of a military power relationship between the British and the Tahitians. The Tahitians had tried to get the British to leave. They'd attacked the British ship with rocks, and then the British bombarded the island for 5 days, killing people. And then after that naval bombardment, women came down to the ships and then started this legendary sexual escapade between the sailors on board the Dolphin and the local women. The Wallis voyage then leaves, and several months later, a voyage captained by a French voyage was sailed into Tahiti, and what they experienced is what really sort of supercharged this connection with classical Greece, and that is that almost immediately the sexual exchange took place between the men on his voyage and the women of the island. And it's Bougainville who describes Tahiti as New Kythera, the birthplace of the goddess Aphrodite. And he didn't connect that history of violence and the way that the sexual exchange was a way of pacifying the enemy and gaining a control in the situation. Instead, all of that is erased, and it becomes instead this episode where everybody in Europe takes back this story that here in the South Pacific is this embodiment of women who have been arrested in time, that they are embodiments of these women, these mythical figures who existed in the past. And that is where the European appetite for finding out more about the Pacific and images, really began. That was then augmented a few months later when the second British voyage came, captained by James Cook on the Endeavour, who then had another, one of these classical sexual escapades on the island, and took all of that baggage back to Britain. And so that's how it really begins. And it then takes on different forms, but it creates an expectation amongst so many ships and their crew that come into the Pacific for many years afterwards, that people literally say, why can't you be like you were in the days of Bougainville? Why can't you be like that? And so there is this expectation that the women of the island perform and be these incarnations of classical figures. And, it's a very suffocating, reductive expectation and trope, but it's one that becomes incredibly powerful as a colonial agenda unravels in the islands.
Thank you so much for those perspectives. So important. And I think it demonstrates how Gauguin leaving for Tahiti just didn't came, an idea overnight. Him saying like, oh yeah, let's go to the opposite side of the world. No, it was like it was a myth and a dream that has flourished over Europe for 100 years prior to him leaving for the South Pacific. This myth that is built around the women, about the sexual availability and their lust specifically for white men, it seems so far out. It had nothing to do with reality. There was a lot of misunderstandings between what was happening between the colonializers and the colonized people. Today, one would think that this myth is so far out that it doesn't have any power anymore. What are your thoughts about that, Angela? Because looking at your practice, you feel like still, at least as an audience, it seems like you still have a need to confront and challenge these exact same myth that was operating already in the 18th century.
Yes, I do, because they are so powerful and enduring, because myths are so powerful and enduring because they speak of the innate human qualities that are within us. The want to be loved or to be seen, or to be powerful, enduring myths that speak of or warn of the qualities within us that could build us or destroy us. And so what I find really interesting when I started researching Gauguin was that when he arrived in Tahiti, that he was quite disappointed with his arrival there, that the myth of a bountiful and beautiful tropical paradise was lost due to colonialism and Christianity. And Christianity is a tool of colonialism that still is enduring to today and has such a violent and enduring impact on Pacific Island cultures that last to today. And so what I find really interesting about the myth of the hula girl or the sexually available Pacific Island woman is that it's still not true. Pacific Island culture is very, very Christian. I grew up as a Mormon, and so I was expected to be fully covered. And so I think it has a very grating impact when we have tourists that come to the island that expect something but see something else, which is something that Gauguin experienced way back then, and it's still being experienced now.
Right. So the tourism that in a way Gauguin, you could say, was part of the same thing, you know, introduced to the idea of moving somewhere. There were a big visual culture already existing of so many images and descriptions of a specific geographical place that you have never been to. So you are already kind of like settled in your head before arriving. And when you arrive, you are looking for those experiences or those images that are confirming your ideas you had beforehand. I think we should see one of your works now, Angela, and then dive a little bit deeper into how you work with producing and creating counter narratives to some of these myths. And this video work we had the pleasure of presenting in the exhibition, and it's such a powerful work, and especially combined now with, I just learned this experience you had with the Kevin Costner film, being objectified, being part of a production that is really objectifying and confirming this whole idea of the South Pacific island girl. And then you moving behind the camera or behind the canvas from being a model to now being the artist is such an interesting power move. Thinking about all the models in Gauguin's works that we don't know the identity of, we don't know their situation that was going on between them when Gauguin was painting those models. It seems like it's a way of reclaiming agency as well. Maybe it's something you want to tell us a little bit about more in relation to this work, Material Culture, that we touched upon earlier in the talk.
Yes. So what I began to realize through collecting these items, I think, well, my very first item that I had started to collect, or that began this obsession with collecting on eBay, was the Barbie doll. Her name is Polynesian Barbie, and on the back of the box had a blurb on what Polynesian Barbie's life was, and it conveyed again those ideas of coming from paradise and living carefree and unbounded and no rules, unrestricted. And so I had this very visceral moment in reading this box, because it was so not my lived experience. And so that's really the beginnings of collecting. And then it wasn't until I had amassed quite a bit of these things or objects that I started to notice, because around the same time of realizing I was reading Patricia's book. I've read it twice. And so I really started to see the ways that colonialism or neocolonialism have used Pacific bodies to further their agenda. So to emasculate the Pacific Island man by inferring that they are savages, and by overly sexualizing the Pacific Island woman, so that they are seen as passive and available for the taking, as part of the spoils of colonialism.
I think these two displays is demonstrating and illustrating very precisely the ideas of that was flourishing in European mainstream culture and directed towards the South Pacific. And I was wondering, Patty, if something similar were happening in Gauguin's lifetime, if you could talk about, or can one talk about, a 19th century tourism or mainstream culture that were dealing with the objectification, commodification of specific ideas and objects.
You mean during Gauguin's lifetime?
Yeah, this is like the mapping Angela has done here is very precisely demonstrating also a tourist industry, right? Like ideas that are flourishing today. But I was wondering if that kind of visual culture or early tourism was present in Gauguin's lifetime.
Oh yeah, I think, I mean, obviously, you know, mass tourism is very much in a nascent stage, the traveling around the Pacific, even though, well, there were, you know, steamship routes and things like that, you know, so there was like slow boats around the Pacific, people traveled that way, but it was, you know, tourism as such was quite in a nascent level. I think in the 19th century, for most people who weren't involved in sort of maritime industries or the plantation economy, which was such a huge part of the Pacific economy, which is completely diametrically opposed to the stereotype, because the stereotype doesn't say that these people ever work. You know, their work is to enjoy life and the bounty of nature, and they don't have, you know, these women don't have to do anything except pleasure. You know, pleasure is their only pursuit. Well, the reality of Pacific lives was something entirely different at that point in time, not least because of the role of Christianity, which has, you know, completely problematized the, you know, sexuality, and that the notions of sin and you know, covering the body and so on. So I think in terms of artworks that were available that conveyed this image in Gauguin's lifetime, I think, you know, the big one, of course, is photography. So, you know, photographs and you know, travel posters. But I think in terms of people going into the Pacific, you know, that mass tourism industry, I think people are still armchair travelers at this point in time. But with the opening up of steamship routes and things into the 20th century, then you start having and Hollywood films, and, you know, like a whole incarnation of the stereotype in a new medium, that you start having another way that people start interacting with the Pacific, and you have people, you know, colonial societies being formed in the Pacific. They become, you know, they flourish, they grow, particularly in the 1930s. But of course, it's the war that really sort of takes this to a whole different, you know, different level again. But Gauguin, for many people who come after him, he is the window into the Pacific. He is the way. He's seen, as I said, as the authentic vision of the Pacific, the way the Pacific is supposed to be. And you know, again, it's very much what the European imagination wants the Pacific to be, and everything that's different from that is really blotted out. So you start seeing that, you know, the hula shows and in Hawaii and things like that, that they are still in their early phase, but they really start to take off in the 20th century. So there is this real expansion of that imagery and the ubiquitousness of it as the lives of Pacific people were getting increasingly divorced from that, anything close to the reality of being, you know, leisured people living traditional lifestyles because of the impact of colonialism.
Thank you so much for that. I think a thread throughout this conversation so far has been that this very strong myth built around the South Pacific woman, especially, says much more about those making the representations than actually the subjects being represented. Mm-hmm. And I want to go a little bit back to the beginning of this myth of the South Pacific and talk a little bit about water, specifically in relation to the South Pacific female body and also sexuality. But I think we should start with one of your newer works, Angela, because we don't have that much time left. Time flies. But it's a nice end note to be here because it's a more recent work by you. So maybe you want to go through some of your initial ideas about the work, and also how you chose to use classical past like motifs. Like this is a reference to Venus, right?
Yes, and what I find really interesting about artists such as Gauguin, and this work was made in response to Matisse and his bronze sculpture of Venus. What I find so interesting about them being in Tahiti was, I'm not sure if they realized that they were actually in the cradle of the Pacific, the birthplace of the Pacific. It's our Mecca. And so prior to colonization, every year, Pacific Islanders would come from all around the Pacific to a specific island in French Polynesia called Raiatea, and would share knowledge and worship the common god Oro. And so I'm not sure if you can see right at the base of the Clam Tower is a rock that is a 3D image from Rapa Nuian artist to commemorate the coming together of Pacific Island people in the 1990s. And so the making of this work is all 3D scans of real objects, and the only thing that is fake is water and the sky. And so what I love about water is that it rejects the old notions, old Western notions of the idea of the woman being irrational or emotional or wet as something and sexual as something bad or negative, and so just really facing into that and saying that we are powerful and we are so much more than those negative connotations when you join a female body plus water.
Thank you. So Patty, maybe you want to elaborate a little bit on the use of classical subjects. Like for here, Angela, you have chosen to make a reference to Venus, but then doing it throughout your own like kind of counter narrative, challenging the Western ideal of the beautiful Venus being born in the sea. So these references to me is so weird that the Europeans have used so often when describing the South Pacific culture. Patty, why do you think that Europeans chose to use those kind of classical figures?
Well, I think it was the closest. I mean, I think I'm trying to think of specific examples where it was an very clear connection and evocation of those classical images that I don't think they had any other reference point to kind of explain people who lived in that relationship with the sea. That this was the only reference point that they had in their cultural cultural heritage that they could deploy, and I think that what where that kind of met the colonial agenda is because so many of these people arrived in the Pacific and they wanted to have these transactional sexual relationships with the local women, and seeing these women as being embodiments of a classical past, there's any kind of sense of moral responsibility or consequences or power relationships or anything like that just get erased from that relationship, from that transactional relationship. It's seen as naturalized. It's seen as just what the inherent nature of these people. So that's why I think why these classical images serve this purpose, because they're pre-Christian. And so that whole moral responsibility, that whole weight of sin is just dissolved immediately. And so that's something which, you know, some you know, I'm thinking of one quote where a sailor, American whalers actually literally said, and I have it in my book, you know, that they hung their morality on Cape Horn. So once they came into the Pacific, they too could shed any kind of sense, you know, of responsibility or sin. They could do whatever they want. God, you know, the Christian God didn't prevail in the Pacific. And it didn't matter if they were, you know, had wives back home or whatever. You know, they just indulged in something. It's consequence free. It's you know, there's no kind of you know, there's no cost to this for the men's souls or whatever. And that's why I think those classical, evoking those classical images, apart from sort of serving a poetic purpose, it had a very political purpose as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are running out of time, but I think thank you so much for both of your amazing ideas and sharing your works, Angela, with us, and your research, Patricia. I think it demonstrates really well how discussing Gauguin and going beyond Gauguin opens up to a really broad range of possibilities when writing art history, when thinking about visual culture surrounding the works of Gauguin that we know so well. And there is still much to be written. There are still many voices yet to be heard. So also just leaving this presentation as an open invitation to the many more voices we need to hear about Gauguin and beyond his works as well. So thank you so much for joining me for this conversation.
And thank you, Anna, and of course, Patricia and Angela, for having this conversation as part of our series. I think you raised a lot of very thought-provoking points, and I very much appreciate your sharing your artwork with us, Angela, and to you, Patricia, your scholarship. And Anna, once again, I applaud you on the exhibition that you staged in Copenhagen and in Berlin. I'm so glad we were able to host this discussion. And again, it will be recorded for posterity and found on our website. And thank you to our audience for attending today. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.